Vice President of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. That's quite a mouthful, James J. Thank you so much indeed for your time. OK, give us the defense analysis just a few hours now into Turkey's operation into northeastern Syria. What's foremost the issue that needs to be considered? You can take the Turkish side, you can take the American side. We'll talk about both.
No, I think that's exactly the right question. Look, I don't think you can legitimately dispute Turkey's reason for doing the operation. This is an uncontrolled border. Syria does not have control of its own borders. Turkey has a legitimate interest in ensuring its own security and ensuring that that territory is not a platform for terrorist attacks against Turkey. It also makes perfect sense to create a zone where refugees could return to Syria and start to reconstruct their lives. So I think those are both absolutely legitimate concerns. Where Turkey's going to be held accountable for is the conduct of the operation. So you asked exactly the right question. Well, what are people looking for? Certainly, there are civilians in the area, and when you're doing combat in the presence of innocents, you should do everything possible to safeguard those innocents. So I think that's number one. The second thing is there are some foreign fighters and ISIS folks have been detained in that area. If those come under Turkish control, then Turkey absolutely has a responsibility for detaining those individuals and taking care of them in accordance with international responsibility. If ISIS fighters are running around loose, then Turkey has an obligation, because we don't want terrorists coming out to police them and clean them up. And then, obviously, look, we all have common cause in here in wanting a stable Syria, where elements, whether part of the SDF or YPG, it's in the best interest of Turkey and those guys not to be fighting each other, and so we don't have to needlessly expand violence. The United States has been a great interlocutor with Turkey and Kurds in Kurdistan and other places. We should try to look for solutions where we can find mutual security. So I think that's what the international community is looking for. The Turks meet those responsibilities. There'll be a lot of criticism and yelling and sniping, and there always is. But I think that the Turkish government will have met its international obligations, and in the end, that's the important thing.
Okay, my colleague here, my Turkey analyst, Yusuf Erim, also wants to put a point to you. So I'll bring Yusuf in, if you don't mind, James J., and then I'm going to pick up on another point.
Oh, well,
sure.
Very relevant points that Turkey needs to take into account during this operation. But one of the most important things to consider in this operation is what happens after the military aspect is over and the governance structure starts to come in. Now, one of America's most important questions in their mind, many of the Americans are worried about a Daesh revival in this area. And so what type of governance Turkey can provide? What type of governance do you think Turkey can provide in this area? Will it be better than what the SDF has provided?
Well, again, I think that the two key issues are if you are the obligation to detain ISIS fighters that are a threat to the region, and the obligation to thwart any terrorist activity or organization, whether it's PKK or ISIS or Daesh. I mean, from the U.S. perspective, right, the U.S. is active in Syria because of U.S. interests. And we have very limited interests in Syria. Syria's never been a friend of the United States. It's never been crucial to us operationalizing our strategy to bring stability to the region. What do we want? We don't want the caliphate back. We don't want the problems of Syria to spill over into the greater Middle East and into Western Europe. We don't want to see millions of refugees on the road destabilizing Turkey or Europe or any other country, because that's bad for regional stability. It's bad for us. And we don't want Syria to be a platform for Iran to be a threat against Israel, which is America's strongest allies in the region. If Turkey does what it says it's going to do in this operation, it does not threaten any of those key interests of the United States. So again, I think that the issue is how Turkey conducts itself. And your point of, well, what happens after the military operation is concluded? Well, that area will then be under Turkish control, and the United States will look to Turkey to meet the responsibilities that satisfy our interests. So we don't want to see a terrorist platform. We want to see people taken care of. We'd like to see refugees go home, and I think the points that were made before about, where does this all go? Well, we don't know where it all goes. Certainly, the United States with a few hundred military personnel is not going to end the Syrian civil war, and I don't know how the Syrian civil war ends. Our obligation right now is to make sure it doesn't become a broader problem for the region. And if this helps contribute to setting a conditions for a future stable Syria, that's all to the good. But much of that will hinge on how Turkey meets its responsibilities.
No, I agree with much of what you said. I think President Trump a couple months ago, when he said it's time to hand Turkey over to people with skin in the game, and Turkey definitely has skin in the game, being on Turkey's borders and the national security threat that the presence of Daesh and the YPG do pose to Turkey. So hopefully what the United States is planning on doing is not just a withdrawal, a handover, as was talked about previously back in December 2018. It was briefly discussed a handover of this territory, a more coordinated move between the United States and Turkey would probably provide much more better security for the region and allow Turkey to combat Daesh and take over the responsibility of these Daesh prisoners in a much more orderly fashion.
Well, but you know, that gets to the point is, you know, the United States has limited interests, limited capabilities, and limited influence. The U.S. doesn't have the power to just tell people to hand territory over to Turkey. We can talk to people, we can negotiate, we can try to do that. But we are in that country to look after our interests, and our capabilities are very limited. And if the United States magically had the power to tell people what to do, there wouldn't be a war to begin with. And you know, and I think this goes back to a really important point is, U.S. policy has not changed. I mean, the president's tweeting and comments and everything else aside, if you look at what U.S. policy is, it's consistently the same thing. We have limited people there that are out doing very specific things to help look after our interests. We're not there to solve the Syrian civil war. We're not there to reconcile all these disputes. We don't have the capacity, the capabilities, or the interest to do that. And I think this somehow has been portrayed as the United States greenlighting what Turkey is doing, which it certainly is not, or the United States and saying we could have just told Turkey which we can't. We don't have the capability or the influence or even the inclination to do that.
James Hay, let me ask you, do you think that there's how much veracity is there in Recep Tayyip Erdogan's statement in what he said in a phone call to Donald Trump, that this operation is going to help pave the way towards a political process in Syria? He says, obviously, he wants to bring peace to the area. Now, the idea that I've been thinking about is that with the regime now controlling most of the country, if Turkey can bring stability to this part of northeastern Syria, does that make it more likely, as President Erdogan says, that it is another step, a concrete step towards an eventual political process in Syria?
I seriously doubt it. But on the other hand, if Turkey can provide a stable territory that is not a platform for terrorists aimed at either Turkey or other country, and it provides a safe space for refugees to return to their homes, that's an enormous positive contribution in a country where we don't see happy things happen very often.
So at what stage do we reach the potential start of a political process? Forming a constitutional committee that sits in some room in a comfortable air-conditioned hotel is one thing, but when do we see the start of a real political process?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not optimistic that there's a clear path forward here. There are many actors with many conflicting interests. And anytime you have an international situation with many actors with many conflicting interests who don't really care about reconciling, I'm not very optimistic. But on the other hand, again, I look at it from the U.S. perspective. We would love for the people of Syria to be at peace, and we would love for the country to be whole and have a freely elected. We'd love that, right? But that is not, you know, that's not our problem. Our problem is to look after U.S. interests. We are concerned about the greater stability of the region as a whole, because there may be millions of people living in Syria, but there are hundreds of millions of people living in this whole region, and we can't let the problems of Syria metastasize and become a problem for everybody. That's way important. And we can't let terrorists have little sanctuaries and run around the world killing people. So the United States has to focus on those, because those are things we can influence. You know, whether there's a future political process in Syria and Turkey can positively contribute to that, you know, I'm a Christian. I pray it's so. You know, we'll see. But again, I'm not optimistic about that. But to me, that's not the point here. The point is if Turkey does the operation in the manner in which they said they plan to, and they establish a zone that refugees can return to, and it is not a platform for terrorism, that is a positive and useful contribution in and of itself and worthy. And I think we should hold the Turks accountable for what they do. And if they do it well, we should be as willing to thank them for that, as we are so willing to criticize, assuming that it's all going to go bad.
James J. Carafano, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much indeed for speaking to us here on TRT World. If you're just joining us,